Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today we're heading straight into the whirlwind that is COP29, trying to make sense of it all. Lots to unpack, I think.
Absolutely.
We got some fresh reports straight from Baku and Anadolu Agency, Euronews in both English and Turkish, by the way.
Oh, wow.
And then to really get those brain juices flowing, some sharp analysis from İklim Haber and Cescenter.
Nice.
Plus a pretty crucial UN report that we definitely need to dig into.
Looking forward to that.
So we're talking climate finance and the whole fossil fuel dilemma. You ready to tackle this?
Let's do it. And I think it's important to emphasize right off the bat, this isn't your typical COP. It's being called the $1 trillion Climate Summit.
Trillion, with a T.
Yeah. Trillion with a T.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Break it down for us. Why the dramatic price tag?
Well, you remember that pledge back in 2009 where developed nations promised like $100 billion a year to help developing nations fight climate change?
Right.
That deadline's coming up in 2025. And the world, well, it's a whole different ballgame now. We're not talking billions anymore. We need trillions annually.
Okay, so what's changed so drastically in the last 15 years to justify that kind of a jump from billions to trillions?
I think the sheer scale of what we're up against is so much clearer now. That UN report we've got, it's pretty stark. Developing nations, they need something like between 187 and $359 trillion. Trillion for climate change adaptation. Just adaptation. Think about it revamping entire energy grids, building infrastructure that can withstand, increasingly extreme weather, and basically shifting whole economies away from fossil fuels.
Whoa, that's quite a transformation. And I'm guessing there are some pretty heated debates about who's footing the bill for this.
Absolutely. Major tension right now between developed nations pushing for more private sector involvement and developing nations who are, well, they're wary of taking on mountains of debt through loans.
Right. Makes sense.
There's actually an analysis from the IDEÇ, that's the Independent Expert Group on Climate Finance, and they found that some countries are actually paying more in debt repayments than they're getting in climate finance.
That doesn't seem very fair.
No, it doesn't.
So, okay, how does all this high-stakes financial maneuvering actually affect, the average person? Why should our listeners care about these figures being thrown around at a summit, worlds away?
Because those financial commitments, or the lack thereof, they have very real consequences. They directly impact, everything we're trying to do to combat climate change globally, which ultimately affects all of us. Energy costs, food security, how often we see those extreme weather events, how intense they are. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about the kind of future we're building.
Okay, point taken.
Yeah.
It's clear that money talks, especially when it comes to climate action. But let's be real, there's another big issue here. Our dependence on fossil fuels.
Right. And speaking of fossil fuels, one of our sources, Yeşil Gazette, they pointed out this surprising statement from Azerbaijan's President Aliyev. He called oil and gas God's gift at the summit.
God's gift at a climate summit that's all about moving away from fossil fuels.
Yeah.
That's a bold statement. What's the context there?
Well, it's crucial to understand, where he's coming from. Azerbaijan's economy is heavily reliant on oil and gas. It's something like half of their GDP.
Right.
So from their perspective, it makes sense why they might have a more favorable view of these resources.
I get that, but doesn't that raise questions about their commitment to the whole point of COP29? Seems a bit like a conflict of interest, wouldn't you say?
It definitely adds another layer of complexity. Some critics are saying this could actually hinder their ability to be an impartial host. And we've got this BBC report suggesting that Azerbaijan might actually be using COP29 as a way to attract investment in their national oil and gas company, Cescenter. So there could be an economic motive at play here, too.
So on the one hand, we have this urgent need to transition away from fossil fuels.
Right.
Which is, what they agreed upon at COP28.
Right.
But then we have countries like Azerbaijan, whose economies are completely built on these resources. Seems like we've got ourselves a real dilemma here.
You nailed it. This is a huge tension point that's likely to play a big role in how the negotiations at COP29 play out and what the outcomes will be. It really highlights this global challenge of balancing economic interests with, environmental sustainability, something a lot of countries are struggling with right now.
It makes you wonder if any real progress can be made at a summit hosted by a country so invested in the very thing we're trying to move away from.
It's a valid question, and it's one that a lot of people are asking. And to make things even more complicated, we've got another big development.
Wow.
The U.S. election results.
Oh, yeah. Donald Trump's victory is definitely a curveball, especially considering his stance on climate change in the past. I'm really curious to see how this might affect the discussions at COP29. Our Euronews articles, especially the English ones, seem pretty worried about what this means for the whole global climate agenda.
Yeah, the concern's understandable. Trump has a history of climate denialism. During his last presidency, he pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement and rolled back a lot of those environmental
So
regulations.
the big question is, will he do it again?
He's already hinted that withdrawing from the Paris Agreement is on the table, which has definitely sent shockwaves through the international community. The U.S., they're the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases, so they have a huge role to play in global climate action. And if they back out of their commitments, it could create a domino effect, with other nations following suit. It's a scenario that a lot of people are worried could derail the progress made so far.
It's definitely a blow to those who are hoping for strong U.S. leadership on climate change. But are there any potential silver linings here?
John Kerry, the former U.S. climate envoy, he's suggesting that this could be an opportunity for other nations to step up and fill that leadership void.
Interesting.
He thinks the rest of the world might actually be even more motivated to prove that they're serious about tackling climate change, regardless of what the U.S. does.
So could this be a case of the U.S. taking a step back, but the rest of the world taking 2 steps forward? Definitely a possibility. It'll be fascinating to see how it all plays out at COP29. But I'm also wondering about the financial side of things. Would a less committed U.S. mean less funding for these climate initiatives, especially for those developing nations we were talking about earlier?
That's a major concern. The U.S. has been a significant contributor to climate finance, and if they back out or reduce their contribution, it would definitely be felt. This could put even more pressure on other developed nations to step up their contributions, and it really raises the question of whether those ambitious trillion-dollar funding goals can even be met.
It seems like we're entering uncharted territory here. The whole landscape of climate action is shifting so rapidly, and the outcome of COP29 is now even more uncertain. But let's dive a little deeper into the specific debates happening at the summit.
Yes, let's take a closer look at what's actually being discussed on the ground in Baku. One of the key things they're focusing on at COP29 is this thing called the Mitigation Work Program. It's basically all about turning those big climate goals into concrete action.
Okay, so let's break that down. What exactly are they proposing in this program?
So it tackles a few key areas. One of the big ones is halting the construction of new coal-fired power plants.
Makes sense. Coal's a major contributor to greenhouse gases.
Exactly. Big step. But I can imagine that's a tough sell for those countries that really depend on coal for energy.
Right.
It means huge investments in other energy sources and infrastructure. That's where those financial commitments we talked about earlier come in. Absolutely crucial. Without the money, even the best plans well, they're probably going to fail.
It's like this massive puzzle, and all the pieces, the money, the policies, the political, they all have to fit together perfectly if we want to make real progress.
Exactly. And another piece of that puzzle is tackling methane emissions.
Okay, remind me why methane's such a big deal in all of this.
It doesn't hang around in the atmosphere as long as carbon dioxide, but it's actually a way more potent heat-trapping gas. So reducing those methane emissions, that's a huge opportunity to slow down the warming, at least in the short term.
Got it. So how do we actually address those methane leaks?
A lot of it comes down to improving infrastructure and practices in industries like agriculture and natural gas production. Think capturing leaks from pipelines, managing livestock waste better, and adopting those more climate-friendly farming techniques.
So it's not just about the switch to renewable energy, but also about plugging those leaks, those emissions from all these other sectors.
Exactly. And of course, scaling up renewable energy sources is another huge part of the mitigation work program. But this transition has its own challenges too, like needing better electricity grids, figuring out storage for things like solar and wind energy, and making sure it's a fair transition for the people working in those fossil fuel industries.
Sounds like a monumental task with a lot of moving parts. Are there any specific examples from COP29 that illustrate how complex all of this is?
Yeah, actually, one of the Anadolu Agency articles, it's in Turkish, focuses on this pledge signed by the EU and 25 other countries. They're calling for a commitment to no new coal in their national climate plans.
No new coal. Sounds promising. Is everyone on board with that?
It's not that straightforward. For some countries, like Australia, it's more of a symbolic gesture. They're already phasing out coal domestically, so signing the pledge doesn't really change anything for them.
But for others, it's a tougher call, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Imagine being a developing nation that relies heavily on coal for energy. transitioning away from that, even with financial help, it's a daunting task. We're talking about completely overhauling their energy systems, potentially displacing workers, and then there's the whole economic fallout to navigate. The
Yeah.
article mentions Turkey as a really interesting case study. They've got these ambitious plans to ramp up solar and wind power, which could actually make a no new coal commitment doable, but it needs careful planning and, of course, a lot of investment.
It sounds like each country is trying to find its own path towards that lower carbon future while also dealing with its own unique situation and challenges.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. That's what makes these negotiations so tricky. The goal is a clear keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, but getting everyone moving in the same direction, even if they're taking different routes to get there, that's the challenge.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that these global discussions have very real consequences for people's lives, their jobs, their communities. Speaking of which, can we circle back to the U.S. election results for a minute? It's been on my mind, especially considering the potential ripple effects on COP29.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely been a major development that's cast a bit of a shadow over the summit.
Our Euro news sources, especially that article, Trump's election victory casts a shadow over COP29 in Baku. They're not painting a very optimistic picture.
The concern is understandable. They're pointing to Trump's past actions, pulling out of the Paris Agreement, those rollbacks on environmental regulations, and his campaign promises, which basically doubled down on those positions.
It's a reminder that things can change quickly in politics, and those changes can have a big impact on global efforts to tackle climate change. A lot of people are worried that a less committed U.S. could embolden other nations to backslide on their promises. Years of progress potentially unraveled.
It's a legitimate concern. The U.S., as the world's second largest emitter, they hold a lot of sway. If they're absent, or even worse, actively resisting, it could have a ripple effect, making it much harder to reach those climate goals.
But amidst all this uncertainty and apprehension, is there any room for optimism? Could this actually push other nations to step up their game, to take on a more prominent leadership role?
It's definitely possible. John Kerry, as we mentioned before, thinks this situation could actually motivate the rest of the world to act even more decisively, to prove that the global commitment to climate action is strong, regardless of what the U.S. does. It could be a powerful show of solidarity, a refusal to let one nation derail the progress that's been made.
I like that take. It's a reminder that we're not powerless in the face of these challenges. There's a global movement building for climate action, driven by people, businesses, local governments. And that collective power can be a real force for change.
Absolutely. We're seeing more investment in renewable energy, more ambitious pledges from cities and regions, and a growing wave of activism demanding action from those in charge. All of this adds to a momentum that's hard to ignore.
So while there's definitely uncertainty about what the U.S. will do, the fight against climate change is far from over. It's a global challenge that demands a global response. And that response has to be multifaceted.
Exactly. We need governments to set ambitious targets, to implement strong policies. We need businesses to innovate, to invest in clean technologies, and we need individuals to make sustainable choices in their everyday lives. It's a collective effort. We all have a role to play.
It's a powerful message. Despite the complexity, the setbacks, there's still hope. And there's still so much we can do to shape a better future. But I want to bring this back to our listeners for a second. How can they connect with these global issues on a more personal level? What can they actually do to make a difference in their own lives?
That's such a great question. It's important to remember that individual actions, when you multiply them across millions of people, can have a huge impact.
So what are some concrete steps our listeners can take to be part of the solution?
There are tons of ways to get involved. Reducing your carbon footprint is a great start. Think about how you get around. Can you walk more, bike, take public transport? How about your energy use at home? Can you be more efficient with heating, cooling, the appliances you use? And even your diet eating less meat, especially red meat, can really lower your environmental impact.
Those are great practical tips. But beyond individual actions, are there ways to engage with these issues on a bigger scale?
Absolutely. Staying informed is crucial. Read articles, listen to podcasts like this one, follow those reliable news sources, and don't underestimate the power of your voice. Reach out to your elected officials. Let them know that climate action is important to you. Support organizations working on environmental protection. Talk to your friends, your family about these issues. The more we raise awareness, the more we demand action, the more pressure our leaders will feel to actually make meaningful change.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play, and even small actions can contribute to something much bigger. But let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. What are some of the main things you hope our listeners are taking away from this deep dive into COP29?
First, I hope they have a better grasp of just how complicated climate change really is. It's not just about cutting emissions. It's about completely transforming our energy systems, adapting to a planet that's already changing, making sure the transition is fair for everyone.
It's a multifaceted challenge that needs a multifaceted solution.
Exactly. And second, I hope they realize that even with the setbacks, the political games, that feeling of sometimes feeling hopeless, there's still reason to be optimistic. There's a global movement for climate action gaining momentum, and we're seeing real progress in technology in how we think about these things.
It's a powerful message. The challenges are huge, but so is our ability to innovate, to collaborate, to be resilient.
Well said. Actually, let's shift gears a bit and look at this whole COP29 thing from a slightly different angle.
I'm intrigued. What's next on the agenda?
I want to talk about the role of young activists at COP29. They've been a powerful voice, pushing for more urgent action and holding world leaders accountable.
That's a fascinating topic. Let's dive in.
You know, we've been talking a lot about these big global kind of top-down approaches to climate action.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to also remember the power of grassroots movements.
Absolutely.
And one group that's been particularly vocal at COP29 is, the youth activists.
Oh, yeah. They've definitely been making their voices heard, demanding action, holding leaders accountable. It's pretty inspiring to see, actually.
It is. They're not just sitting back and waiting for things to happen. They're out there, organizing protests, pushing for bolder commitments, calling out hypocrisy where they see it.
Right. They're the ones who are going to inherit this planet, so it makes sense that they're the ones leading the charge.
Yeah.
What are some of the key messages that we're hearing from them at COP29?
I think one of the biggest things is this sense of urgency. They're basically saying, look, we don't have time for empty promises and half measures. We need action now.
Yeah. Now being the operative word.
Exactly. They're also calling for greater intergenerational justice, which basically means recognizing that the decisions being made today are going to have a huge impact on their future. They're the ones who are going to be living with the consequences.
It's a powerful argument.
Yeah.
And it's hard to argue with that logic. They're not just fighting for themselves, they're fighting for future generations.
Right. And they're also pushing for greater inclusivity in these climate negotiations. They want to make sure that the voices of those most affected by climate change, people from marginalized communities, developing countries, are heard and taken into account.
It's a reminder that climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's a social justice issue, too.
Yeah.
It disproportionately affects those who have contributed the least to the problem.
Exactly. So these youth activists, they're bringing a really important perspective to COP29. They're injecting this energy, this passion, this moral clarity that's sometimes missing from those high-level discussions.
It's a reminder that change often comes from the bottom up, from people demanding more, pushing for better.
Absolutely. And these young activists, they're a force to be reckoned with. They're not going away, and they're not going to be silenced.
Well said. It's been quite a journey, this deep dive into COP29.
It has.
We've gone from those trillion-dollar questions of climate finance to the very real challenges of phasing out fossil fuels, the shadow of the U.S. election, and the inspiring rise of youth activism.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
So as we wrap up, what are some of the key things you hope our listeners are walking away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this is a defining moment. The decisions we make now, collectively and individually, are going to shape the future of our planet. And that's a huge responsibility, but it's also an incredible opportunity.
Absolutely. It can feel overwhelming at times, but it's important to remember that we all have a part to play. Whether it's making changes in our own lives, engaging in our communities, or holding our leaders accountable, every action, no matter how small, makes a difference.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks to everyone for joining us on this deep dive into COP29.
It's been a pleasure.
And we hope you'll tune in again next time for another deep dive into, whatever the world throws at us next.
Until then, take care, everyone.
And keep the conversation going.